So the title of my talk is Species Being and Ethical Life. Sorry, just give me 1 minute. I always have to move these little boxes around a bit when I get started because they always show up in a place that I can't quite control. Okay. So in his book, Hegel's Ethical Thought, Alan Wood characterizes Hegel's ethical philosophy in terms of a dialectical or historicized naturalism. For him, Hegel's approach to the ethical counts as a form of naturalism because it is founded upon a conception of human nature. So what human beings need, what is good or bad for them, what fulfills and sustains them, what they ought to do, what conditions enable or distort their ability to realize their potential. All of this is determined only in connection with our understanding of the kind of thing a human being is. Hegel's specific brand of naturalism is historical and dialectical because he doesn't approach human nature as an eternal essence, something fixed and unchanging for all time. Rather, human nature is at once the process and result of the self-determining activities of all human beings, activities that are essentially social in character, and whose processes continually change both the natural world that human beings inhabit, as well as human beings themselves. So that's the dialectical bit. What Hegel calls ethical life, or Sittlichkeit, is the determinate shape of this ongoing historical process. And in the philosophy of right, Hegel provides a snapshot of what he takes to be its characteristic modern form, at least as viewed from the perspective of a social position in which that form of life could be self-described as rational, from the point of view of a social position in which one could be at home in the totality of ethical life. So I think we can develop Wood's characterization of Hegel's ethical philosophy in two further directions. First, from the above description, it's clear that this position of historicized ethical naturalism is not exclusive to Hegel. Wood himself compares Hegel's ethical naturalism with its classical non-historicized counterparts in in Plato and Aristotle. And after Hegel, of course, the philosopher who develops this position into a full-fledged critique of the capitalist form of life is Marx. Marx's version of the thought begins with an understanding of historically developing human nature in terms of Gattungswesen, species being or species essence. I'm just going to use the standard species being in what follows. He also calls it Gemeinwesen, community, communal being, or communal essence. And from here, Marx argues that the capitalist form of life fundamentally distorts, incapacitates, deforms, and degrades the potentiality contained within human beings, such that ethical life as a whole is a wrong, false, or dehumanized life. This is a way that he puts it a lot in his early writings, that there's something dehumanizing about this particular form of life. On the face of things then, although Hegel and Marx begin from a similar methodological orientation, they basically end up with fundamentally opposed snapshots or pictures of ethical life. Far from constituting a rational totality in which one can be at home in the world, the capitalist form of life, according to Marx, is alienated and inverted, frustrating human potential to such a degree that human nature itself appears primarily in a distorted form. And in Marx's sort of very enigmatic phrase, he says that, okay, instead of the rational is the actual, reason has always existed, but not always in a rational form. So developing this Wood's suggestion in a second direction here, I think we can also characterize the philosophical thesis behind the idea of ethical naturalism as follows. The basis upon which we draw when we determine what something is identical to the basis upon which we draw when we evaluate it, when we determine whether or not that something is as it ought to be. In other words, all forms of ethical naturalism, including historicized versions, oppose the Humean suggestion that is claims and ought claims are radically and categorically cut off from each other, proceeding instead from the assumption that any evaluative claims that we may make about an object, so here in our case, what human individuals and society ought to be or do, are essentially connected with our description of the kind of thing that it is. So what human individuals and societies are. This is at least one way of approaching Hegel's famous Doppelsatz, in which he suggests that there is an identity, or probably better, a dialectical relationship between the actual and the rational. We draw from the same basis, the same grounds, namely human nature, in order to both describe and evaluate the quality of ethical life. Although things become notoriously more complicated when the nature in question is at once historically developing and reflexive, the basic philosophical thesis of ethical naturalism concerning the necessary connection between the is and the ought holds in full, I think, or I will try to show, for its historicized version, which I believe has significant consequences for how we understand the philosophies of Hegel and Marx, not to mention critical theory, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So in what follows, this is just sort of a rough outline of what I'm going to do in the 3 sections of the paper. I'm going to explore the idea of historicized dialectical ethical naturalism by investigating the relationship between what Hegel calls ethical life and what Marx calls species being, proceeding in 3 steps. So first, I'm going to argue that ethical life can be understood in terms of human species being and present some important parallels between these 2 ideas. Once this parallel is established, what comes into view is that a concept of the life of the species forms the background context in which features of ethical life are both understood and evaluated. Second, in order to understand the role of species concepts in judgments concerning ethical life, I turn to Hegel's treatment of the nature of evaluative judgments in general, what he calls judgments of the concept, as presented in his Science of Logic. Hegel's treatment of this type of judgment shares important affinities with contemporary approaches to ethical naturalism, and some of these affinities help to further illuminate the connection between ethical life and species being. Investigating Hegel's approach to this very particular form of judgment also allows us to understand in more detail what is naturalistic about historicized naturalism and why ethical life as second nature nonetheless still concerns nature. So third and finally, this is a brief concluding section of the paper. I'm going to turn to what looks like a fundamental discontinuity between ethical life and species being. Whereas Hegel is clear that ethical life refers to a bounded human community, and even more specifically to the modern nation state, species being for Marx emphatically refers to the human species as a community, an idea that Hegel regards with deep suspicion. The discontinuity between Hegel and Marx appears most perspicuously when we consider the difference between evaluative judgments concerning ethical life and world history. Within the context of ethical life, it seems that the species concept in question provides us with a sufficiently determinate context for making evaluative judgments about particular cases. But within the context of world history, things get a lot muddier. The species concept in question is often too indeterminate to make clear evaluative judgments about particular cases of right or wrong action. Hegel's going to call this a domain of imperfect justice. I argue that this apparent discontinuity between Hegel and Marx is not it's not genuinely a discontinuity, but rather I think reflects the way in which Hegel conceives of the human species as historically developing, shedding light on why historicized naturalism is still a form of historicism. More directly, Hegel's so-called amoralism in the domain of world history reflects the fact that humanity as a Gemeinwesen does not yet exist, which is why evaluative judgments in this domain are exceedingly difficult. Okay, so the first section is called Ethical Life and Species Being. So the best way of understanding the convergence between Hegel and Marx on the concept of species being is to turn to Hegel's notion, very well known, especially among this audience, notion of spirit or Geist, an idea that constitutes the content of the overwhelming majority of his philosophy. Here, I want to consider 3 central and related definitions of Geist, which together constitute an outline of what Hegel takes to be a definition of the human life form, and all of which I think are basically adopted by Marx in his own account of species being. So first, again, all of this will be well known to you, but I hope drawing the connection to Marx will help us maybe see it in a new light. So first, Hegel, of course, famously defines Geist as the I that is we and the we that is I. which is the complete freedom and independence of self-conscious individuals in their unity and opposition. In defining spirit in terms of the unity and relation of I and we, I think Hegel's account not only establishes a necessary relation between the individual and the community, but moreover, the identity claim is meant to convey that individuals manifest and exemplify the essence of the community, and likewise that the particular shape of the community manifests and exemplifies the essence of what it is to be an individual of that community. This particular type of interrelation between I and we is modeled for Hegel on the self-organizing unity manifest in the relation between a living individual and its species. And indeed, the definition of GEIST as the I that is we and the we that is I constitutes the conclusion of a very, very odd and difficult section that began with a discussion of the form of activity manifest in life. So the I that it comes after that very, very difficult to interpret section on life. In the context of this discussion, Hegel had described the relation between an individual and its species. And here in the passage we're about to look at, the term he uses here is unity or Einheit, as follows. So this is a description from the phenomenology where Hegel is talking about the relationship between an individual and species within the context of life. He writes, "The independent members exist for themselves. However, this being for self is instead likewise immediately their reflection into unity, just as this unity is the division into independent shapes. The unity is divided because it is an absolute negative unity or infinite unity, and because this unity is the subsistence, the difference also has independence only in the unity." So Hegel's definition of Geist, I want to suggest, as the I that is we and the we that is I, is essentially modeled on this description of the relation between a living individual and its species, where individuals exist at once as independent and for themselves, and immediately also as members of a divided yet stable unity of the species, such that they are independent only in the context of also being members of a species. The relation between the individual and the community, I think, operates in a similar way. Individuals of a community are independent and for themselves only insofar as they are also at the same time members of a relatively stable yet internally differentiated community. In a way, none of this should be surprising. Indeed, what would be surprising is if the general shape of the human species bore no resemblance at all to the unity and activity of living species in general. So the first point here is just that I think that definition of the I that is we and the we that is I is modeled on the way that Hegel describes the relation between an individual and its species with respect to all living things. So this brings us to Hegel's second definition of Geist. Although Geist manifests the same structure as living species in general, the fundamental difference, of course, between Geist and non-spiritual species is that Geist is the Gattung for itself, which Hegel immediately associates with self-consciousness. It is important to note that the difference between the human species and other non-spiritual species does not lie in the fact that its individual members are for themselves, which, as we saw in the passage above, is already the case for all living things in general. Rather, the difference lies specifically in the fact that Geist is a species for itself, which means that spirit has an awareness of itself as a species. I stress this point because it is often assumed that the fundamental difference between spiritual and non-spiritual species lies in the fact that spiritual individuals or persons have a distinctive status as individuals, a status that renders them distinct from other living things, which are merely instantiations of their species. Although I believe there is, of course, some truth to this assessment, I think what Hegel is highlighting here is that the distinctive status of spiritual individuals lies in the fact of their species awareness, or more precisely, that their individual status as self-conscious beings is only possible on account of this species consciousness. That individual self-consciousness is essentially bound up with species consciousness is a radical Hegelian innovation with its roots in Fichte that deeply informs Marx's understanding of human nature, forming an important premise in his critique of capitalism. Okay, so the third definition of Geist that is important for our present discussion concerns this connection between spirit and world history. So Hegel identifies world history as the ongoing process of spirit's self-actualization, a process he describes as, quote, the progress of the consciousness of freedom. Two features of spirit's historical character are of particular importance. First, Hegel suggests that the history of spirit is its own deed, for spirit is only what it does, and its deed is to make itself the object of its own consciousness. So far from being fixed or inert, spirit is thus essentially defined as self-producing activity, and moreover, a self-producing activity that takes place by means of spirit's capacity, now borrowing words from Marx, to, quote, make its life activity into an object of its own will and consciousness. So self-directed historical activity is an essential part of spirit's nature. This brings us immediately to the second feature of spirit as historical, and this brings us immediately to the second feature of spirit as historical. Spirit's activity of self-production has the character of free activity, a freedom that for both Hegel and Marx is essentially connected to species self-consciousness. Progress in the consciousness of freedom means progress in the awareness that, quote, all human beings are essentially free, that the human being as human is free, an awareness that guides spirit in its activities of individual and social reproduction. World history, as the process of spirit's self-actualization, is thus defined by having self-determining activity as both its means and its end, a process that necessarily involves and develops the conscious awareness of human beings as a universal species. So from these three general definitions of Geist, I think it's evident that Marx's own definition of human nature in terms of species being is essentially adopted from Hegel. So here's a characteristic passage from Marx that I'm hoping we'll now read as much more Hegelian than maybe we initially thought. So Marx says, this is from famous passage from the 1844 manuscripts, human being is a species being, not only in that practically and theoretically, he makes both his own and other species into his objects, but also, and this is another way of putting the same thing, he relates to himself as the present living species in that he relates to himself as a universal and therefore free being. So I want to note at this point that for both Hegel and Marx, I think Geist and Gattungswesen constitute a formal account of human nature. I think it's a formal account, but not an abstract one. I'm happy to talk more about what that distinction might amount to, but I want to insist on that there's something formal about what's happening here, but it's not abstract. Specifically, I think what their respective accounts describe and outline is the general form of human self-knowledge and the general form of human activity, both of which are outgrowths of the general form of living species and life activity as such. So now with the connection between Geist and species being in view, I now want to turn to the connection between species being and Hegel's concept of ethical life. So started with Geist in order to help build the bridge to thinking about how species being might be relevant for an account of ethical life. So in the third and final section of the paper, I'm going to take up what appears to be the most notable difference between ethical life and species being that I already mentioned, namely that ethical life for Hegel refers to a bounded human community and most paradigmatically a nation state, rather than to a projected or existing community of the human species. However, and despite this difference, I nonetheless want to suggest that ethical life is rightly understood within a general concept of species being, and the most important reason for this concerns the way in which ethical life is a determinate actuality of Geist in the process of its ongoing development. To start, Hegel himself characterizes Sittlichkeit in terms of spirit. So he says the ethical appears as custom, and the habit of the ethical appears as second nature. It is spirit, living and present as a world. Nice echoing of that passage in Marx where he talks about the present living species. It is spirit, living and present as a world, and only thus does the substance of spirit begin to exist as spirit. Thus, where spirit in general denotes the form of human self-knowledge and activity as such, ethical life refers to the actual determinate existence of a form of life, a living and present world in a particular historical moment in which spirit exists with a determinate shape, with specific rights, duties, customs, habits, practices, and most importantly, of course, institutions. Ethical life falls within what Hegel calls objective spirit, but more precisely, Hegel actually suggests that ethical life has overcome the one-sidedness of both objective and subjective spirit, where the one-sidedness of the former treats freedom exclusively in terms of its manifestation in external reality, and the one-sidedness of the latter treats freedom exclusively in terms of the inwardness of individuality. In combining the objective and subjective sides of freedom, ethical life is the concrete actuality of spirit as it exists in a particular historical moment. And in the philosophy of right, Hegel provides a snapshot of ethical life as a human community united, of course, by three primary institutions: the family, civil society, and the state. What ethical life allows us to gauge then is the quality and extent of species being in a particular historical moment, and the specific institutions of ethical life each reflect a particular form of self-knowledge concerning human activity and freedom. So, for example, the family reflects our self-understanding of human beings in terms of natural ethical spirit, such that the practices of that domain are structured around our self-conception as natural beings in need of love and affection, where certain demands have to be met if children are to be reared and the species successfully reproduced. Civil society reflects our understanding of human beings as self-sufficient individuals driven by the pursuit of self-interest, and the institutions of civil society are organized around the coordination and conflicts of these individualistic pursuits. Finally, the state reflects our understanding of human beings as a universal community, committed to a public and political life, and is organized around the aim of providing service to the community. So, a particular consciousness of species or a self-conception of what human beings are is thus always operative in the background of ethical life, a self-conception that governs the aims and structure of practices in a particular domain. Thus, even though ethical life refers to a particular human community in a particular historical moment, the determinate institutions and practices of ethical life all presuppose a conception of human species being, a conception without which these institutions and practices would have no meaning or purpose. That ethical life operates with a general conception of human species being has consequences for how ethical life comes to be evaluated and judged. And it is to this question that I want to now turn. So the second section of the paper is called Evaluating Ethical Life, Species Dependence and Judgments of the Concept. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about the logic, which I know is always a trip. So I've been arguing for the importance of species being in understanding Hegel's concept of ethical life, where ethical life is the determinate existence of spirit in a particular historical moment in the process of its ongoing self-actualization. Insofar as the institutions of ethical life all operate with a self-conception of the human being in the background, I want to now suggest that an important element of Hegel's historicized ethical naturalism consists in a claim about how we make evaluative judgments concerning ethical life, where species dependence is the key for evaluating the goodness or badness, rightness or wrongness of particular cases. Like contemporary ethical naturalists, Hegel argues that our judgments concerning ethical life have a particular grammar and logical form, one that reflects the fact that the human life form, despite all the important qualifications, manifests the same structure as all other living species. To understand Hegel's argument, I'm going to turn now directly to his treatment of judgment in the science of logic, which is surprisingly illuminating in this regard. So the aim is to hopefully use some of these insights from the logic to think about how it is that we can actually evaluate ethical life. So Hegel's aim in the judgment chapter of the Logic is, to be sure, much broader than anything that ethical naturalism is concerned with. Insofar as what he's aiming to do there is to provide an account of judgment in general, rather than an account of judgments about living things in particular. Nonetheless, I think the treatment provided in the Logic is highly instructive for at least two reasons. First, because the entire account is oriented by the idea of genus or species concepts and their role in judgment. And I think it is also inspired by Kant's understanding of teleological judgments in the third critique. Second, because the ultimate question Hegel wants to answer in his account is the question of how one can make evaluative judgments, how predicates such as true, good, and beautiful can be understood as appropriately attached to their subjects. Hegel's argument ultimately is to suggest that the Gattung concept of the subject, roughly the subject's genus, species, or kind, and here I'm just going to use that interchangeably, that the Gattung concept of the subject basically governs the ascription of evaluative normative predicates such that their ascription can be determined as something objective only within the context provided by the species concept. For Hegel, such judgments, what he calls judgments of the concept, constitute what is truly objective in judgment, or he says is the truth of judgment in general. So to arrive at this form of judgment, Hegel employs basically two argumentative strategies, a negative strategy and a positive strategy. The negative strategy is to offer a qualified criticism of two common ways of understanding the relation between subject and predicate, which he discusses under the headings of judgments of existence and judgments of reflection. I say it's a qualified criticism because, as we'll see in a moment, there's just many instances in which these judgments are perfectly appropriate, but they're not going to help us understand judgments in which we evaluate something like ethical life. So in judgments of existence, the relation between subject and predicate is understood in terms of inherence, such that the predicate inheres in the subject, Hegel says. So for example, this is his example in the statement, the rose is red. Redness inheres in the rose as one of its properties, allowing us to identify a particular quality of the subject. Although there is nothing wrong with the inherence model of judgment per se, a question immediately arises concerning how we are to determine whether or not the predicate is an essential or non-essential property of the subject. Insofar as the inherence model is unable to answer this question on its own terms, Hegel then turns to a subsumption model in which the subject is subsumed under the predicate, what he calls judgments of reflection. In the subsumption model of judgment, the predicate can be identified as the essential property of the subject rose, if indeed all roses and not just one or some can be subsumed under the predicate red. Progressing from subsuming this rose to some roses to all roses under the predicate, Hegel suggests that what is being anticipated here in the subsumption model is already sort of a transformation. He says that what is being anticipated is the universal nature or species of the subject. In the judgment of reflection, however, the universality in question remains an allness of counting, a plurality, or what he calls an empirical universality that remains a mere progression to infinity. In other words, on the subsumption model, the concept of allness in question is entirely quantitative. So if we were to take this as a model for thinking about species being, we would only have a quantitative all, right? The human species is simply a quantitative counting up of all of the members of the human species. And so this means that a solution, and sort of going back to the problem earlier, insofar as this concept of allness is merely quantitative, it means that as a solution for the question of essential versus non-essential properties, the subsumption model is only going to get us as far as statistical probabilities, allowing to establish that some property holds in most cases, or that in all observed cases, insofar as exception has yet to be found. So as I noted above, the negative outcome of Hegel's account of inherence and subsumption is not meant to be an outright rejection of these two models. Rather, and in an Aristotelian vein that informs many contemporary approaches to ethical naturalism, what Hegel is suggesting is that our ability to determine essential versus non-essential properties presuppose that we know what kind of thing the subject is, and ultimately allows us to establish whether a predicate is essential to the subject. What allows us to establish whether a predicate is essential to the subject is its relevant Gattung concept. Restricting our discussion here to judgments concerning living and spiritual subjects, Michael Thompson, for example, has argued that statistical generalizations do not allow us to explain many judgments that we make concerning living things, particularly in cases where what we want to identify as an essential property is in fact a statistical anomaly. So, for example, our favorite example in the classroom, very few acorns actually become oak trees. In a friendly corrective to Thompson's account, Philippa Foot makes an even stronger claim, defending the idea that what distinguishes an Aristotelian categorical from a mere statistical proposition about some or most or all of the members of a kind of living thing is the fact that it relates to the teleology of the species. For Foot, then, we know that what we are ascribing to the subject is essential when it plays a functional role in the life of the species, particularly when it speaks to individual and species self-maintenance. This brings us now finally to Hegel's positive argument, which I'm going to try to present in two steps. First, Hegel claims that the subject's species concept or kind is what he calls an objective context that allows us to distinguish between essential and non-essential properties, and thereby allows us to determine what something is essentially. Second, Hegel argues that this same objective context is also what allows us to ascribe normative evaluative predicates, allowing us to determine whether or not something is as it ought to be. So let us take a brief look at these two steps in turn. So the first step of Hegel's argument is introduced with a new form of judgment, what he calls judgments of necessity. Judgments of necessity introduce the idea of an objective universality. And I think this idea of an objective universality is very important for understanding Marx as well. And he associates this with universality determined as genus and species, which constitutes the substantial basis of the particulars that fall under it. Something's Gattung concept is its objective, universal context of determination, not only because it allows us to distinguish essential versus non-essential properties, but moreover, because it allows us to understand the relation between subject and predicate as a relation of necessity, as for example, when we say the rose is a plant. This relation of necessity is what prompts Hegel to refer to the Gattung concept as a substantial basis or Grundlage, since it allows us to make conditional statements such as, if the rose is, then it is a plant, where the consequent is a necessary condition for the antecedent. So the second step of Hegel's argument finally brings us to judgments of the concept or evaluative judgments, which take the following form. He says so judgments of the concept look like this X constituted so and so is good, bad, etc. The idea of something's constitution is meant to convey the thought of the necessary relation between an individual thing and its kind, where the character of its particular constitution becomes meaningful only in connection with its relevant species concept. Evaluative predicates then follow from the idea of something's constitution according to its Gattung, and the question is what warrants this line of reasoning on Hegel's account. The idea of an individual's constitution, I think, appears to be the key. Hegel suggests that the concrete subject of an evaluative judgment is internally fractured or divided into two moments, its individual constitution on the one hand, and the objective universal of its relevant Gattung on the other. This internal division, contained, he says, in all actuality, is the distinction between what something is and what something ought to be, where the Gattung constitutes the standard or measure of whether or not an individual case is as it ought to be. If it is indeed accepted that something's genus, species, or kind is the objective necessary context for the determination of essential versus non-essential properties, then it follows that the Gattung has normative powers with respect to its members, governing to an extent what and how the members that belong to it ought to be. For Hegel, what the objective context of the species provides are the grounds for assessing the particular constitution of individual members, grounds that allow us to evaluate those individual cases according to the standard of its own life form. So I think Hegel's account, so that was a very quick, probably too quick account of some arguments from the logic, but I think Hegel's account of the species dependence of evaluative judgments has important consequences for how we evaluate ethical life, especially when ethical life is understood as a form of human species being determined in a particular historical moment with a particular constitution. First and foremost, when we say that the human community constituted according to so-and-so practices and institutions is good or bad, the substantial basis of such judgments is nothing other than the human life form itself. And this in a way just brings us, this is a very long way of reconstructing, I think, what was at the heart of what, where I began, the Alan Wood's account of how he understands historicized ethical naturalism. I also think, so the substantial basis of these evaluative judgments about ethical life is nothing other than the human life form itself. I think this is another way of interpreting Hegel's suggestion in the introduction of the phenomenology, this very famous line that, quote, the essence or standard lies within us. That the criterion by which we judge the distinction between what is and what ought to be, or between appearance and essence, is nothing other than human species being itself. The species dependence of evaluative judgments in Hegel's account also suggests that ethical life can be said to have what Foote calls an autonomous, intrinsic, or natural goodness and defect, one that depends directly on the relation of an individual to the life form of its species. This means that there is a direct connection between Hegel's naturalism on the one hand and his method of immanent critique on the other. Critique is immanent because, like all other living species, ethical life has an intrinsic natural goodness or badness, one that depends entirely on the relation between an individual form of ethical life in a particular historical moment to the life form of the human species as its objective universal context. This sheds light on the first part of Wood's suggestion with which I began, and what I just mentioned, namely that Hegel's naturalism consists in the fact that the ethical is founded upon a conception of human nature. So what of the second part of Wood's suggestion concerning the fact that Hegel's naturalism is also a form of historicism, insofar as human nature is the self-determined product of free activity continually in the process of development? Although I will now try to address this question in brief, and it'll likely be too brief, it is important to note that Hegel's general logical point concerning the species dependence of evaluative judgments must remain intact, even when we turn to the problem of the historical character of human species being. There is nothing in Hegel or in Marx, for that matter, to suggest that the fundamental grammar of our evaluative judgments changes when the life form in question is the human one, or that our consciousness concerning our existence as a species means that our self-evaluations can somehow be species independent. Indeed, both Hegel and Marx clearly suggest the opposite, namely that without the human life form as a criterion, our evaluative judgments concerning ethical life have no objective basis or standard at all. Okay, so this is the last section of the paper, short concluding section, species being and world history. So as I noted above, what appears to be a major divergence between Hegel and Marx is that whereas ethical life refers to a bounded human community and paradigmatically to the nation state, species being refers to a universal human community, an idea that Hegel regards with deep suspicion. Although there is no doubt that Hegel's account of ethical life grants priority to the state, he nonetheless refers to world history as, quote, the actualization of the universal spirit, and more famously, that this universal spirit, the spirit of the world, is the highest right of all, such that world history is the world's court of judgment. In referring to world history as a court of judgment, it is clear that objective evaluative judgments continue to be operative in this domain. However, Hegel emphasizes that the judgment and justice of world history is an imperfect justice. And I want to suggest that the imperfection here is due primarily to the fact that human species being as a universal Gemeinwesen does not yet exist with sufficient determinateness. In other words, it is not that evaluative judgments in the domain of world history are not species dependent, or that we cannot make evaluative judgments concerning right or wrong action in this domain. Rather, judgments in the domain of world history are imperfect, complicated, and often plagued by contradiction and ambiguity due to the fact that the species concept in question is in a continual process of historical development. And most importantly, it is not sufficiently actualized as an institutional reality supported by a community of free wills that can generate clear and determinate ethical rights and duties. So to conclude, let me very briefly outline how I think Hegel and Marx treat the problem of species dependence of evaluative judgments in the domain of world history in turn. So at the highest level of abstraction, Hegel claims that basically what guides the development of world history is, quote, the concept of the freedom of spirit alone. So this is quite abstract. The concept of freedom of spirit is clearly far too indeterminate to generate concrete rights and duties between states, leading Hegel to say, quite alarmingly, that the nation state is, quote, the absolute power on earth. Each state is consequently a sovereign and independent entity in relation to others. At most, the presence of international law or contracts between states generate a weak sense of obligation, where each make mutual stipulations, but at the same time, he says they stand above these stipulations. That the evaluative claims in the domain of world history are mere stipulations rather than genuine ethical duties is a direct result of the indeterminacy of the human species concept in that domain, and not simply a result of a principled skepticism regarding cosmopolitan ethical life. Rather than a principled claim concerning the impossibility of clear evaluative judgments in the domain of world history, Hegel's position rests, I think, on a historical contingency, namely a historically developing human species concept not yet sufficiently realized to generate clear ethical duties. So given Hegel's skepticism, how might we understand Marx's approach to the species dependence of evaluative judgments? I think perhaps the first thing to say is that for Marx, human species being is less determinate than Hegel suggests. So this would be a disagreement between them. Given that capitalism is a complex global institutional structure that traverses national boundaries, an argument could be made that Hegel simply misjudged the degree of indeterminacy in our universal species concept, for the system of needs was already in Hegel's own time a universal system with determinate social roles, customs, regulations, and laws. While Marx does not articulate the point in terms of ethical duties, this nonetheless suggests that Marx's evaluative judgments concerning capitalism as a universal form of life have a substantial basis in a sufficiently determinate species concept, one that is far more concrete than suggested by Hegel's the concept of the freedom of spirit alone. Hegel's fixation on the state perhaps blinded him to an already existing global institutional reality, one whose development was itself fully bound up with the development of modern nation states. I think a further difference between Hegel and Marx's approach is the following. Although Marx, like Hegel, identifies species being with the general form of human activity and self-knowledge, his more substantive claims about human nature are more often put in negative terms, where human nature is famously alienated, inverted, and incapacitated within the context of the capitalist form of life. Although elaborating on this thought take us well beyond the aims of the paper, I believe this departure from Hegel is one of Marx's most important contributions to critical theory, one that takes dialectical, historicized, ethical naturalism in an entirely novel direction. Thank you.
That is fabulous. Thank you, Karen. we couldn't have actually designed two more complementary keynote speakers. I know you couldn't hear Rahul's talk because it was 2 a.m. in the morning, but I mean, they're just absolutely beautifully complementary. So thank you very much for that. So now open the floor for about 40 minutes of questions.